Hi everyone, Bill Duvendak here, and I would like to take this opportunity to introduce the Sphinx cell to you. The Sphinx cell is a subgroup within the greater Temple of Ascending Flame, so in order to join it, you do have to be a member of the temple first. Now, when we're talking about the Sphinx cell, what we're talking about is working with ancient Egyptian magic and deities known as netters, but specifically pre-dynastic deities, even though we go up into approximately the third dynasty. This work has been inspired by my own self-exploration of ancient Egyptian magic over the years, as well as the writings of Kenneth Grant and many newer independent Egyptologists and researchers who have been shedding light onto this very transformative and important period in the development of our species. Even though this is restricted to those who are already temple members, a lot of the work that we are doing in the Sphinx cell will be published in various books to come out in the future. And the first one that has come out came out in 2019 called A Draconian Egyptian Grimoire. So if you are wondering if this work may be for you, you might want to check that out before inquiring to the temple at large. Later on in this presentation, we will talk about extensive reading lists and a lot of the people that have really contributed information to this time period. So stay tuned and get comfortable. First of all, let's clarify the Draconian Egyptian tradition. I got this name from the writings of Kenneth Grant. He also calls this the Typhonian Egyptian tradition. And effectively, they're the same. It's just that instead of focusing on Set, this is focusing on the serpent mysteries of ancient Egypt, as well as the same time period. So what we're talking about here is working with ancient Egyptian magic in line with draconian tradition of principles, such as the development of the self, the embodiment physically of the divine spirit that is your essence, and working with those ancient Egyptian archetypes in a very fiery, proactive, mental plane kind of way. So the time period specifically is pre-dynastic Egypt. As a matter of fact, we generally don't do anything past the third dynasty. And the reason for that is because at the tail end of the third dynasty, and really it takes off in the fourth dynasty, there is a shift in ancient Egyptian thought into what would become the pharaohs and what would become the solar phallic paradigm that blossomed with the development of the pyramids and newer things such as the Old Kingdom and then the Middle Kingdom and then finally at the end and the downfall of the Egyptian Empire. We only focus on the time before the rise of the pharaoh. So it's the oldest of the old. It is very much at the same time and yet arguably much older than what was going on in Mesopotamia. The roots of pre-dynastic Egypt actually date back several more thousand years than what is currently accepted in conservative thinking, but it puts it as a tradition that goes back as the oldest codified structure that we know of on the planet. So in other words, if you want to work with solar deities, this time period, it restricts you to just those solar deities that were present at the time before the rise of the pharaohs. Now, the Luciferian connection is quite interesting to consider because the title Lucifer means light bearer. It was through this fertile time of coalescence that the flame of what would become the solar system of the ancient Egyptians was being incubated. So you can think of this as the pregnancy time. Now, what that means is that there are a lot of parallels between the ancient Egyptian thoughts of that time and Luciferian consciousness now. For example, Luciferian consciousness now is all about bringing yourself more light, however you define it. During that time, the world, the planet itself, was coming out of the most recent ice age. So people that were sequestered away, isolated from others, began to travel. Environment shifts, climates changed. Civilizations that existed before that had now crumbled to dust. So people were coming back together to form the very beginnings of what would eventually be known as the city-states. So this was a time of reconnection from the grand scope of the human species, but it was also a time of development in that when you get more people together, more light. And here we're talking about the light of consciousness, the light of innovation. These things can happen the more people that you have in the picture. Now, the draconian connection I hinted at earlier, and we're going to take a moment now to talk about it a little bit further. It's not commonly talked about, but there is a large draconian connection with ancient Egypt. The serpent mysteries that we know about from ancient Egypt are some of the oldest ones from there. But yet the deities that correspond to those particular teachings haven't really survived intact into common times. So we get mentions of names. We get descriptions. We do get functions, but when you put it into context of what we know about, say, Asur and Aset, or Ampu, or Ma'at, or Bast, it pales in comparison. So we only have fragmentary information, and the reason for that is because it's quite old. But in ancient Egypt, we have key serpentine symbolism coming out of that tradition that a lot of people don't realize. For example, they had their version of a phoenix, or what the Native Americans called the thunderbird, in the form of what they called the Bennu bird. Another good example is the fact that the sacred symbol of the Ouroboros, the serpent eating its own tail, comes from ancient Egypt too. So we know that it had a strong connection in the oldest of the old times, and that connection lines up with the draconian tradition from other belief systems on the planet. So where I'm going with this is part of the Sphinx cell mission, as it were, is to explore this lost information. Most people, whether they're professionals or hobbyists, focus on later kingdoms, but in this work we focus on the oldest of the old and what gave birth to what would eventually become the world's longest standing spiritual tradition. Now, if you want to know more about it and check it out to see for yourself if you think it would be a good fit, or if you just want to know more about this particular time period and how it ties into the Luciferian and Draconian currents, here is an extensive reading list for further reading. Of course, I'm going to toot my own horn and put a Draconian Egyptian grimoire in there. Draconian Ritual book by Asenath Mason is a great introduction to maybe clarify what the Draconian tradition is if you are not familiar with it. Set, Fury of Egypt is an anthology put out by the Temple of Ascending Flame, and it talks about all things Set, just like you'd expect. The writings of Edward Malkowski. He is a fairly new writer on the scene, even though he has produced a lot of good work over the last few years. Personally, I don't think he gets the recognition that he deserves, but he focuses on this time period from more of a scientific historical perspective, whereas in the Sphinx Cell we focus on the spiritual tradition. And of course the writings that started the whole thing off, the writings of Kenneth Grant. In his 9-volume Typhonian saga, he takes the reader through a lot of this information and then catapults it into the future as well. So in his books, we find the seed ideas that I developed while working on the Sphinx cell and the Egyptian books that I've put out so far. I hope this has been a good introduction for you. If you want to know more, there's plenty of resources here in this video and lines to consider, and maybe I'll see you in the Sphinx cell.